Isn't it funny, Tom, how when you're at a restaurant now and you hear a baby cry and it's somebody else's baby, it like is music to your ears. It's like, good, then my baby can cry and I don't care as much.
There's two people on airplanes. There's people that have never had kids, and I don't care about their opinions anymore. And there's people that have had kids, and they get it. And if they don't get it, they're sociopaths. So like now I'm relaxed on planes. I'm like, you either get this or you don't, and it's not my problem.
Amen. Amen. Oh yeah, we're supposed to have a podcast. Welcome to the Future's Edge Show. I am Jim Uriel. That's Bob Iacino. If you don't know who that is, that's Tom Morgan, who is the Curiosity Sherpa. Tom, can you explain to people what you do?
Almost certainly not.
Can you take a crack at it?
There's a guy called Kevin Kelly, and this is like a self-serving anecdote. There's a guy called Kevin Kelly. He's a futurist, and he says if you can't describe what you do for a living, you're probably on the edge of something interesting because there isn't even a word for it yet. I guess I spent 20 years on the buy side and the sell side on Wall Street and then wealth management. I basically spent an increasingly large amount of my time trying to put meaningful content in front of kind of wealthy, powerful, and curious people. And that's what I do full time, is essentially write about interesting stuff, try and synthesize it, and often in a markets context, often in a kind of a life and thematic context.
Okay, so this is your curiosity thing, and I did some looking into the things you've said before. And here, something I pride myself on, and let me finish before you judge me, is that my lack of curiosity. I think it comes from, and this is about certain things. Like I grew up in a house full of 11 people that at any one time, at least 3 of them should have been under some sort of criminal investigations for events that had been happening around town. So when it came to me, it was always like, I don't know. And I genuinely didn't want to know. I remember one time, Bobby, you remember Mike Pelko, who got arrested for murder on the trading floor? Remember this story?
Yeah.
He worked at our company. And the day he got arrested, I didn't know he got arrested. I pick up a phone and it goes, hi, this is such and such. He didn't even say where he was. And he goes, do you have a Mike Pelko working for you? And I swear to God, I didn't even know that anything was up. And I go, never heard of the guy. Click. So now is my type of lack of curiosity. That's just a survival instinct, right? Tell me more about what you think of curiosity.
I'm going to go immediately into the turbo strange. I'm going to ask you a question.
Sure.
Either of you feel free to answer it. Can you control what you're interested in?
Yes.
No.
Right. Okay. It's a yes and a no. Jim, if I told you, I mean, you've just told me you're aggressively disinterested in certain things, so I don't believe your answer. But like, if I told you had to spend the rest of your life watching like cricket or being an accountant, relative to doing the stuff you're doing now and talking about markets, right? There must be stuff you really don't care about, like whether it's, the Real Housewives of New Jersey. There's something like there is a spectrum of things you're interested in. Now you can force yourself to grind at that stuff, but you can't force yourself to be passionate about it. Do you disagree with that statement?
I mostly agree, but I mildly disagree. I would think for my first 7 to 8 years in the business that I chose, I was disinterested in the fundamental market moving things. I was interested in price and I was interested in making money and what I had to do that. But it took some time. And then after a couple of years, I became passionately interested in macroeconomics. Does that answer your question?
That's a great nuance. So let me ask you, let me say why I'm asking the question, which is that I believe curiosity is an attractor. And if there's a single idea that fries the noggin of about 90% of the people I speak to, it's the concept of an attractor, which is that we were all raised to think that we live in this indifferent box, right? Where it's like nothing's worth more than anything else. It's all a bunch of atoms colliding into each other until we die alone. I believe that curiosity is actually the manifestation of evolution, that we are drawn towards certain information that evolves us very specifically into a niche. And that niche is something that we find easier than other people do. And I can go into like the whole complexity science angle in this, which I find fascinating and other people will find really, really boring. But I think if you just look around and find that and find that like conceptually true with most people that you know. That like my wife, like the reason why I mentioned Real Housewives is my wife can watch Real Housewives for an indefinite period of time, and I would rather kill myself, right? Like, and I love all these thinky abstract conversations about neurology, and equally she absolutely cannot stand it. And everything exists on this spectrum. But I think that the specificity of that spectrum relates to the individual niche that you're going to occupy from an evolutionary perspective. So to go back to why I spend any of my time doing this, if you can put the right interesting information in front of people and maybe kind of direct them away from the stuff that wastes all our time, that's actually really helping with like the manifestation of human potential. That's helping with individual evolution. Because I do believe there is some information that's like more nutritious than others. There's a lot of empty calories out there.
Yeah, I'd like to go further into this because the reason I answered no so quickly is something I've been talking to my family about. Since I moved down to Florida, I've become unwillingly interested in birds. Now, can you think of a bigger nork, just a dorky, nerdy thing to like is knowing which bird is which? I mean, what am I, 100? I moved to Florida where most people are 100. And then I go out there and I'm like, wow, that's a coonhound bird. And that's an osprey. That is not a red-tailed hawk. And I don't want this hobby because I can't think of anything less cool, being the guy with tattoos that grew up on the west side of Chicago. But I can't stop. It drives me crazy. And I also cannot make myself interested in things that I'm not interested in. And, my wife and I are married coming up on 4 years now, 4.5 years, something, I don't remember, 5 years. So, and I try to get her interested in American football, just doesn't happen. And she tries to get me interested in these completely brainless series that she binge watches, like Gilmore Girls and Sex in the City. Mm-hmm. And I literally have heated up a sharp fireplace steak and have gone to stick it in my eye if she won't change it. Right? I'm like, these are your two options. You have a husband with an eye patch or you change the damn channel. And I wonder if what Jimmy said is like he had no interest in the macroeconomic fundamentals and then it just kind of happened. Like, Jimmy, do you think, and a legitimate question, do you think you went, wow, I do kind of want to learn this? Or did you notice something and went, wow, that's pretty cool, and all of a sudden you started becoming interested in it?
What I think I noticed was that the psychology more than the machinations of macroeconomics, like what a Fed chairman is thinking and what he's saying. And that started to become very, very interesting to me.
So to your point, Tom, you want to try and help people not be interested in things they're interested in that don't help them. Am I saying that right? And is that possible to do, given what you asked?
Well, let me actually just reflect something that both of you said. This may be a bit woo and weird, but one of my buddies, Frederick, who writes a great Substack on finance, he talked about how there's a woman that goes into natural environments and listens to birds, right? And she's a willing bird watcher rather than unwilling bird watcher.
Yeah, it's not me.
Yeah, exactly. But he talks about how she'll go into the same environment that the three of us would be in, and her literal experience of that environment will be completely different to ours because of the richness of the things that she's experiencing, and she can hear the different communications, different species. She inhabits a totally different world. And Jim, what you're saying to me is that once you got deeper into the investment world, it disclosed more to you that you could find like intrinsically interesting, and you could pursue that in a way that clearly has evolved you because you're occupying a great position within that world. So like one of the benefits of markets is that it's such a deep well that basically it can take you in a lot of different directions. Because when I started at Merrill Lynch in 2005, a couple of years out of college, I had no intrinsic interest in the markets. And then suddenly, very similar to you, I was like, oh, wait, they're paying me to learn about the world and psychology and new technologies and the way everything fits together. And superficially, I had no interest in any of that. But when I realized how intricate it was and how fast paced and how everyone else in the industry was really very impressive and curious, like that became an incredibly exciting place to be. But superficially, the reason why I didn't go into finance out of college, like all of my other peers, I was like, no, that sounds awful.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that from a perspective of what just kind of jumps out at you, I totally understand the analogy of being immersed in that world of birds. Again, I'm surprised I said this publicly because I literally is the least cool thing I can think of. Cool's kind of my thing, Jimmy, right?
Sure it is, Bob.
in my brain it is. But it pulls me in this direction of the more that I look at it, and it makes sense what you said, the more I think Jimmy being immersed in it, something I've come to learn about Jim Thomas, that he's very disciplined about things. So he gets into something and he's like a pit bull with a tennis ball. You can't get the ball out of his mouth the minute he gets into something. And that's, I think, part of what you've said, because Jim is also very focused on things that benefit him, not things that don't. So, for example, cold plunge, right? He learned about cold plunge. He tried it. He's all about it. I can't get him to shut up about it now.
Oh, there'll be a cold plunge segment a little later on when I go to help you, Tom.
Yeah, but so when we talk about that, I think it makes nothing but sense that we can't control the things we're attracted to as much as we can interested in, as much as we can't control the things that we're not interested in.
Right. And that was why, like, when I did that speech at Sohn the other day, I was like, right, if you've only given me 5 minutes to compress 10 years worth of research, like, I'm going for the big boy. I'm going for curiosity, because I think I've watched this mostly anecdotally, but with a shed load of research to support it, is that people that tilt a little bit more to following their curiosity, their lives work out better. And particularly when, like in finance in particular, my cohort is guys between 35 and 55 that have gone stale in some aspect. And the level of certainty they require to sacrifice something old for something new is pretty high given their income levels. And I'm like, just treat your curiosity a little more seriously on the margin, and maybe run some experiments with different identities and different ways you can live your life. And that will prevent you from getting stuck and stagnant in ways that I saw really, really hurt people in my cohort.
Well, I want to say something about Jim again, if I could. And Tom, I want you to comment on it. And Jim, I want you to jump in if I'm wrong.
No.
I just think Jim, again, knowing him as long as I did, he just doesn't clutter his brain. The second he's interested in something, again, you can't divert his attention. And he jokes that a lack of curiosity is a superpower. And he definitely has a short attention span. But again, I think it's because I always say it's because his brain is smaller than mine and can't fit as much.
It's probably because my mom smoked like a chimney and drank martinis when she was pregnant with me too. But what were we talking about?
Well, do you think somebody who just says, yeah, I'm not interested in that, is that something you'd like them to be more open towards?
Well, let's respond to Jim. Jim, how do you decide what you're interested in?
Usually, well, Bob hit something on the head. Like my upbringing, again, like where I came from, the 5th child out of 7, it was very much of a you eat what you can kill sort of upbringing. So I'm very, very selfish in my but again, one of the things I'm selfish about is I love making people happy and getting a pat on the back, but I do it for myself. But anyway, that's not, I'm not saying I am selfish, and I do things and look at things that usually benefit me. Like I wasn't interested in the restaurant business until 11 years ago when we bought a restaurant out of the blue, me and a buddy of mine. And then all of a sudden it was like, wow, this is pretty cool. People come here, they spend money, they pat us on the back and tell us how wonderful we are. I'm into this. You know what I mean? And then I'm totally all into it. But it is more about what benefits me. I don't have any like hobbies like my next door neighbor who digs holes and fills holes, I think, in his backyard. I'm not sure what he does. He's my buddy too. He's a great guy, but I don't know what the hell he's doing in his yard all the time. I pay a guy $100, my lawn looks better.
Well, let me give you a framework then, which is one I found really useful. Like it's a running joke on Twitter and amongst my friends how like tediously obsessed I am with this Scottish polymath called Dr. Ian McGilchrist that has this brain hemisphere theory that legit changed my life. Like legit changed my life.
Yeah, I want to talk about this.
Yeah, I want to talk about that too.
Don't even open that Pandora's box, man.
We have to.
We're going to be here for about 3 hours.
If we're going to kill 3 hours.
Well, it's 1,500 pages, his second book, so I got time. One way I think about this is that almost everything is middle ways, right? It's balance of opposites. And this is probably a gross oversimplification, but it does come from a paper a friend of mine wrote, where it's like at one end of the spectrum, you have full left brain lock, which is autism, where you can laser focus on something for 9 hours, but only if someone tells you to focus on it. So Bobby, like, I want you to learn this programming language, and you just like will be able to focus on that for as long as possible and far longer than other people. But for example, if the label's digging into the back of your neck, like that will be so distracting you cannot function. And that's why a lot of autistic people cannot look at a human face directly, because there's so much information in there they don't know what to focus on. The other end of the spectrum equally is not super desirable. That's called positive schizotypy, where like everything is significant and you're constantly like having your attention turned. What you want is to be a bit like an apex predator, where you have very, 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 very broad attention. You have the ability to recognize significance, which is the key to everything. But then when you recognize significance, you go straight in like Jimmy, go in hard for as long as you need to go until that energetic niche is kind of exploited. And then you get up and you exploit again. So it's explore, exploit all the way over. That can last a lifetime. That can last 10 minutes. But it's that interplay between the two that I think is really important.
So when we talk about the curiosity, and these are very interesting points, and it helps with a self-evaluation. What's the takeaway? Can people control where they point their curiosity and become better at whatever it is they choose to be good or not good at?
Categorically. I mean, we'll probably tackle it with the cold plunge section. There are practices that people can implement to get more right hemispheric balanced. There are ways people can understand the weaknesses of left hemispheric thinking. There's kind of an approach you have to information. For me, I've spent the last 4 years, I would say, working on this really hard because it's basically my job. I have found that there is an energetic signature attached to information. So when someone recommends a book to me, and because of my job, I get recommended 5 to 10 books a week, right? I'll be like, I'm sure that's interesting, Bob. I won't say this. I'm sure that's interesting, Bobby, but it's not for me. And then sometimes, Jim, you'll recommend something, and I'll be like, there's something in me that just goes bang, and then I hit it, and then I follow that curiosity, and that appears to be a spiral which gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And now my ability to I discovered something a couple of days ago that someone cold DM'd me on Twitter, and I've read 4 books in the last 2 weeks on this topic, and it's one of the richest seams I've ever mined. So I think that is this meta skill that's kind of like wisdom or relevance realization that just basically takes your entire life.
Fascinating. I love that. Bobby?
I actually ordered Ian McGilchrist's book, Matter with Things. And when I saw how big it was, I put it in front of this door that closes with the wind too much. I mean, I don't have time for this, but I definitely want to
get it out. You listen to it. It's easy.
Oh, it's never been narrated, I think, because it would be too long. It's
so long.
50-hour read on Kindle. I interviewed him a couple of years ago when it came out in 2021. And my wife, I was like, Diane, this is my job. So it was 3 hours a day for 5 weeks.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know how you absorbed as much as you did, but I guess that's why it's a 3-hour show. Do you have to read it more than once, just out of curiosity?
No, no, but I read, again, I feel like I'm just actually illustrating my point here. For me, I could suck that up, right? Mm-hmm. And to other people, you're like, you are smoking crack that you could find that interesting.
Did it 10 years ago, Tom Morgan, could he have picked up that book and absorbed it?
No.
Okay, that's interesting to me.
Because it wasn't relevant to my life experience. It wasn't part of my journey at that point.
Hey guys, it's Bobby Icino, co-host of The Futures Edge. If you watch our show, you can come and join us live. We have an event going on with Scott Shellady, the famous cow guy. You've seen him on TV with his cow jacket, on Fox, on financial networks, as well as his own show on RFD TV, which is kind of a fun network. And the panel consists of myself, Jim Iorio, Michael Lee, and Kenny Polcari. We all know Kenny Polcari very well. Great friend of mine and Jimmy's. And Michael Lee is one of the best sort of down-to-the-bone stock analysts that you're ever going to meet. This is called The Cow Guy Invites You to Greener Pastures with the Common Sensocrats. So there will be policy. There will be politics as it applies to policy, as it applies to markets. So this thing is going to set you up for the next 12 months of investing. We've got a presentation, we've got drinks, we've got fraternization time, and we've got dinner. So check out the link, come to the show. You're going to enjoy it. Nashville, June 13th. We're going to have a blast. It's going to be at the Grand Hyatt Nashville. Great venue. We hope to see you all there.
Okay.
So let's just, as a brief sort of intro into, for anybody else that might want to order this book and use it as a doorstop like I know him. Talk about the left brain versus right brain, because a lot of people wouldn't understand or actually just kind of wouldn't get to it on their own, that they may be using the wrong side of their brain when it comes to their investments and things like that.
This guy, Dr. Ian McGilchrist, went up to the Genius College at Oxford, All Souls, 3 times, and originally for humanities. And then he became so interested in the structure of the human brain, he became a practicing psychiatrist, and then later a professor of neuroimaging. He's like 70 odd now, lives in Scotland, and he spent his entire career on the difference between the hemispheres of the brain. And it turns out there's a lot of experimental data. There's people that get the two hemispheres of the brain severed due to bad epilepsy. There's people that get one side knocked out by strokes or by accidents. Like, there's really robust data. I think he has 6,000 endnotes in his book and 180-page bibliography. Like, this is like a really robust area of science. The reason why I say that is because whenever you say brain hemispheres to anyone, they think it's all been debunked. And someone comes out of the woodwork on Twitter every single time I tweet anything about this. I'm like, oh, dude, you realize this stuff's been debunked? I'm like, ugh, facepalm. The pop psychology says one side of your brain is creative and one side's mathematical or something.
Right.
That's not true. But what McGilchrist found was that although both sides of the brain can do the same things, they do them in radically different ways. His favorite example is of a bird. That a bird uses the left hemisphere to peck at the ground and to see, is this a piece of grain or is it a piece of sand, right? So it's really narrow attention. At the same time, its right hemisphere is watching the whole environment for cats. So it's, again, this narrow and broad attention together at the same time. Now, this is where it gets, in my opinion, really, really interesting. His diagnosis over these decades was basically we've become imbalanced towards the brain's left hemisphere. And that's really problematic because the right hemisphere is supposed to be in charge. The left hemisphere is linear, it is logical, it is highly verbal, but it lacks context for really anything. And my favorite demonstration of what that actually means is I think in the 50s in China, Chairman Mao noticed that sparrows were eating all the grain reserves. And so he was like, oh, got to kill all the sparrows. So they successfully killed all the sparrows. And then the locust infestation killed 50 million people. It's the worst man-made disaster in history. Think about engagement algorithms. Think about focus on making the quarter. Think about the Fed. Think about any of the trends that you see now in markets in the world. It's often about some guy that thinks he's really smart, like controlling one variable with no sense of global context, and everything blows up. And the left hemisphere creates these disconnected worlds where everything's abstracted. So like social media, video games, metaverses. It has far less access to information. And as a result, you can see people who are like hyper articulate, but completely divorced from the world, seem to be running the world.
Like Fed governors.
No comment.
Politicians, like politicians.
So the left hemisphere seeks control. It is competitive. It is highly powerful, but it is totally abstracted. And you look at like the left brain Silicon Valley like CEOs, right? You look at anyone in office. You look a lot of CEOs, right? Like they exhibit these characteristics because also one of my other the really chilling anecdote that McGilchrist tells is if you experimentally suppress the brain's left hemisphere for 10 to 15 minutes on normal subjects, on you and I, you start to see the world as animate. So the sun crossing the sky, giving you energy, like the world seems more alive and you seem more connected to it. And if you experimentally suppress the brain's right hemisphere, so you become left hemisphere dominant, you start to see other human beings as machinery and furniture and zombies. And so like, if you think about the way that like really sociopathic people treat other people as like vectors to get what they want, that seems to be a lot of the way the West behaves towards the environment, towards our bodies, towards each other. It's these single points of intervention. So I can talk about just be very wary of very articulate people who tell you things that sound really smart but aren't actually true is one of the main things I think about.
Strange question you may not have an answer to, and then I have a real question. Is there any validity toward the idea that psychedelic drugs cause the left hemisphere to shut down or work less, and that's part of the effect of it? Have you ever heard any of that?
Yeah, I've studied a bit of it, and my partner in my new venture actually wrote a book called The Bigger Picture about psychedelics. I don't know because I'm not an expert, and I'd have to ask him. What I do know and believe is that the use of psychedelics reliably flips people's worldview towards more right hemispheric, and it opens up. It creates more openness, which I associate with the brain's right hemisphere. Now, too much openness means you believe anything, and we all know those guys who've done too many psychedelics. So you need openness with discernment. But if people have got really locked into like an egoic structure, which actually happened to me, I had like horrendous treatment-resistant depression for 2 years because I got locked in my left hemisphere, which is why I'm so interested about this topic. But basically, it ended up being dissociatives, which is medical ketamine, that got me out, which basically unblocked that rigidity. So like, yes, I think like, does it specifically act on the right hemisphere? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone knows. But does it break open the brain in a way that counteracts the worst parts of the left hemisphere? I think you can say yes with a really high level of confidence.
So I want to, if we could, talk about an article you wrote a year ago, Investing's Big Blind Spot. It's the article you sent us about Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger. And in there, you made some sort of key differences, or it might have been Charlie Chin, and you were just kind of reinforcing them, between wisdom and knowledge or intelligence. And one part of the article, you talked about how wisdom doesn't necessarily come with age, but intuition is sort of a structure created by experience. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it really was.
I can't work out how much of this is like blindingly obvious and how much of it is profound, or whether it's both. Putting it politely, the Daniel Kahneman System 1, System 2 stuff isn't useful, in my opinion, and it's not even really right. And McGilchrist goes into this very politely in like depth in his book. But it's basically like, is intuition good, yes or no? Well, like, how much experience do you have? If you put a chessboard in front of a grandmaster that's a normal position in a game of chess, and then you take it away, the grandmaster can often completely assemble the chessboard from memory, right? But if the board does not pertain to a game of chess, it's just random pieces on the board, he has no advantage versus a layman. Like, his pattern recognition, having played God knows how many thousands of games of chess, is really, really good. So his intuition about chess is brilliant. My intuition about chess is terrible, right? And so the concept of whether intuition is good or bad is just meaningless without the context of how deep someone's database is. When I've interfaced with really experienced investors, it's how deep is the reservoir of experience that they're drawing from. And yes, that does correlate with age, but often you can accelerate that process by something Cedric Chin writes about, is the concept of strategic rehearsals. So like, what you do with executives is you put them in a room for a day and you make them fail as many times as possible in like a low consequence environment. So usually like, we'll try and avoid failure at all costs, but if you can put them in a bounded environment with set rules and just have them fail over and over and over again in like a meaningful way, by the end of that day, they often have them sleep on it for a night, which is really interesting. And then those people can come back with like fully refreshed models. That means that they don't have to get fired. So you can accelerate the acquisition of expertise, which, you know, as we were talking about day trading on the way in, low stakes day trading, that sort of thing. So you can get this like real unconscious pattern recognition. But the bit that I think really messes with people, particularly in our world, is so say you have this enormous well of a lifetime of experience. How do you access it? So what happens is something will happen that triggers that intuition, which is what Munger's talking about. When Munger would see something, he'd be like, oh, this reminds me of Kellogg back in 1964. That he's basically saying that he has a database that's bigger than either of ours, and something triggers it. Now that trigger, and I can't stress this enough, that trigger tends to be somatic. It tends to be a felt sense. And actually, if you ask people to rationalize it, it can destroy it. So like, people who are really good at intuitively judging things, if you ask them to put a process around that, it can actually degrade their intuition because they start second guessing it. But so like, what do I do with this information, Tom? It's all about trying to upregulate that signal when it comes in by increasing the communication between your left and right hemispheres, so that when something gets triggered, you know if it's the right trigger. And everyone's favorite cliche in finance is George Soros' back pain, right? George Soros realized when his back hurt, his portfolio was positioned badly. But he didn't be like, oh, my back's hurting, I need to go and take an Advil. He was able to interpret that signal and realized it pertained to his portfolio, which is really interesting.
So Tom, you before, I loved what you were saying about left brain versus right brain. That's fascinating. So there's a two-part question too. You said the CEOs were left brain. They were articulate, but they couldn't conceptualize, the broader picture. That's a good way to describe it, right? First of all, it has benefited them to be that way. So are you saying that there is incentive to try to bring both together? Because it doesn't seem like there is. It seems like they make stupid decisions, but they get paid, then they go on their way. And if so, how does one just manually try to work on the different hemispheres themselves?
I'll answer the first question qualitatively, which is that like within the current paradigm, left brain people get rewarded, which actually is contributing to the fact that the world's getting more left brained. Like, think about it. Like you and your partner would probably never go more than 30 miles from Chicago like 100 years ago. But
Right.
in the last 200 years, we've been getting much more mentalized. Think about the number of people that use their brains exclusively for work and they don't tinker with stuff, right? And then think about who they're marrying. They're marrying other hyper intellectualized people on a relative basis. So we're all breeding, we're all working in our head all the time. And then society comes in on top of that and says, Wall Street and Silicon Valley, the two most left-brained industries in the entire world, the gains for working in those industries are like asymmetrically different from anything else. So like what you're saying is correct. Yes, go do it. What I'm saying is one, rebalance for a couple of reasons. Most left-brain locked people that I know are really very unhappy. Openness is let's put it a different way. 30 years of research into wisdom said that the number one correlate, one of the main correlates of wisdom is openness. Openness to new ideas, openness to the world in general, like energetically open. And wisdom correlates with eudaimonic and hedonic happiness, which just means how much are you growing and how happy do you feel? And I think you can look at this from like a straight thermodynamic perspective. Like a closed system eats itself. Think about the perma bears you speak to. Perma bears speak incessantly. Like it's a thing you've noticed. A perma bear will be able to speak for 40 minutes without interruption, and they'll never update their priors, often because it's locked into their identity. But most perma bears that I know are unhappier than most people that have very, very flexible viewpoints. I think left brain lock makes you unhappy. And what I've noticed over the years is that, you're literally distanced from the world. I think your happiness is related to how connected you are to other people and how connected you are to the world. And that sociopathy, maybe it works for you, but for most people it doesn't. And what tends to happen in midlife, I've seen, is that a lot of very left brain dominant people, that approach stops working for them. And then they have a very, very significant struggle to rebalance the hemispheres. And I'm saying that from the position of someone that did. I went to all the right universities, got all the right things, was like conventionally mediocre, successful on Wall Street, and then hit the left brain lock moment and had to rebalance. So like I'm owning myself in this context, but maybe I'm biasing my assessment of that, but I think it's pretty robust.
And what about any sort of exercises one can do to try to pull them more left brain? Which, by the way, when a lot of the things you say kind of hit me square in the head too, because there are times, that I am unhappy and think that I am so right and everybody else is so wrong. What does someone like me do?
The answer is, there are some really simple answers, and the answer is it's really complicated. So the left brain says, what individual practices can I do taken entirely out of context that I can utilize to make myself more right-brained? Like, that's really funny, right? Like, it's just like the left brain. Really, and I think that's why McGilchrist.
Yes, it is funny. It just dawned on me, right?
No, but I do the same thing. I'm like, okay.
It literally went over your left brain head.
It went over it for a sec.
That's why I think it triggers McGilchrist whenever people ask him this question, because he's like, that's like the wrong question. I think what you should be doing, and what actually my new company does, is like, it's like, okay, so everyone's different. There's a menu you can pick from of relatively high quality individual practices and things you can do and should do with a professional, because a lot of these things taken out of context and lineage, as the left hemisphere would do, are super dangerous and super risky, and you can get taken advantage of by charlatans. I'll just give you some examples, right? So one of my favorite play along at home things is emotional granularity. Now, there's this guy called Eugene Genlin that he found, kind of depressingly, he found that he could tell within one therapy session whether most people were going to get out of therapy, and it was how accurately they could describe their own inner state. And they found that your ability to use a lot of words to describe the feelings that you're having correlates with your physical health, how long you spend in hospital, your emotional health. And that sounds kind of weird until you think about, like, I'm British. I'm either happy or sad, right? Maybe I can't even make that distinction because I'm so emotionally backwards, right? But if you can use 1,000 words to describe your inner state, when you notice something highly granularly, like a trading signal, like the Soros back pain, George Soros may not have even been like that, my back hurts. He may have been, that's feeling 762, which means it's my portfolio. So you suddenly get this incredible richness to interpret your own intuition, because the left hemisphere is a felt sense and it is emotional. So what all I'm saying is you're learning quite literally to speak the language of your right hemisphere by increasing the vocabulary. And it's a good thing to do with your kids as well. I tell myself I do it with my kids all the time, and then I always forget to do it. But we have like emotions cards so they can learn to use the kids, which is just closing the feedback loops. Another one that people have recommended to me that I haven't done is right hemispheric drawing. So like if I get a photo of you, I would turn it upside down and then I would try and copy it. And the reason why I would turn it upside down is so the left hemisphere cannot get involved in terms of my conception of what a human face looks like. And I just start copying it. There's all sorts of
cool.
Yeah, it's cool, right? There's all sorts of body sensing things you can do. There's dream work. There's breath work. The thing I'll say,
ice baths. There's ice baths too, probably, right? That helps.
See what he does.
Ice baths are huge because they pull you into embodiment, and breath work as well. Like like Wim Hof, cold work.
I do Wim Hof, yeah, right.
Well, I mean, we can talk for a while on Wim Hof, but Wim Hof is like textbook one of these practices. It pulls you into your body, and the breath work puts you into an altered state, which increases your neuroplasticity, as I understand it. Don't quote me on that. But what I was going to say is that for me, it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, DJing, and getting a massage once a week. Why is it those things? Because they give me intrinsic enjoyment. They're not instrumental. They mesh to my personality, and they all give me the benefits that I need. Probably the biggest wisdom expert that I go to is this guy, John Vervaeke, who I interviewed a few months ago. And he says you need to have an ecology of practices. So you need to have like a diversified portfolio of practices. So if one of them stops working, or you just go off it, or you get injured or whatever, right? Like you need to be fully diversified. And he thinks you need to have a meditative, a contemplative, and an embodied practice. And again, like even that's probably too prescriptive. You just have to have a lot of these things. And I think you need to try a lot of them, but you need to try a lot of them very safely.
No, it's interesting. Any of my interests that would fit into what you just described are outdoors, which means that it was just so much more beneficial for me to move to Southwest Florida from Chicago, because I definitely was one of those people that my depression turns into anger. So I don't really get depressed. I get angry. And I would spend the entire winter angry at everybody and snapping at everybody, wanted to kill people on the road because I couldn't ride my bike. I couldn't play ball with my dog. I couldn't do the things that I like to do outside.
Well, do you know the most lateralized emotion and where it's lateralized?
What's that?
Anger in the left hemisphere.
Anger.
And that's just such an amazing insight for me, is that whenever I get angry about something, I realize it's egoic threat. And then, what I'm going to reflect, having known you for 35 minutes, but the first thing you said to me was like, I can't work out why I'm interested in bird watching. It's because you're being pulled into your environment. You're telling me when you're outside of a natural environment, you're disconnected from environment, you get really depressed and angry. Anger, left hemisphere, right? And you're saying since you moved to Florida, you find yourself being drawn into the environment. That's happiness for me. However you find it, I just find that I find that a very interesting.
No, that's very cool, because again, this is the first place where I can regularly see bald eagles, wild turkeys. So next thing you know, all of a sudden, little moonbirds are fascinating to me, and the blue jays that are down here are fascinating to me. In Chicago, and Jimmy will vouch for this, you see a couple of robins, a couple of sparrows, and then those feathered rats we call pigeons running around all over the place. And that's pretty much it. The occasional cardinal, right? So I just never noticed birds, because they're all basically the same monochromatic brown gray that Chicago can be for 9 months out of the year. Coming down here, there's just so much color and so much activity. This is completely off the subject, but I want to ask you about something else. You said a contemplative, you didn't call them exercise, but I'm going to call it exercise. Could that be something as simple as, well, I'm making this up as if it's not me. I enjoy hitting a tennis ball with a tennis racket for my dog on our front lawn. I literally come in with the biggest smile on my face watching this dog run. It is completely, no part of my brain seems occupied. I just like watching her run, and I'm envious of the pure joy she feels chasing that ball and coming back with it and dropping it at my feet and seeing her tail wag. I literally think that as a human being, I could never feel that level of joy off of something so simple. And then that's exactly what I'm doing, because I'm feeling joy watching her do something so simple. Is that contemplative? Is that insane? Am I going to murder 18 people and bury them in my front lawn? Where am I going with this?
Probably.
Well,
Probably.
Your dog would find them, at least. I'm going to back up for a second and just tell you about a concept that's a lot of work to get your head around, but it's worth it. I don't know about you, but I was taught in school that like evolution was survival of the fittest. I'm going to kill you to get what you need, and then we all lived in this dead box, which is going to end in the heat death of the universe when you become soil. Right? It's not true. At least cutting edge science over the last 10 to 15 years shows it's not true. The world is trending towards complexity. The whole of the universe is trending towards complexity, and I'm always like, look outside. Think about the last 20 years of our existence. Are things getting more or less complex? And over relative to 3,000 years ago, 300,000 years ago, or 3 million years ago, is the Earth getting more or less complex? It's like it's not even really a debate. And people can talk about, well, that's just on Earth, or that's just whatever. I don't care. The definition of complexity is something that really, I think, honestly changed my life. A complex thing is made up of very, very, very differentiated parts that are also very integrated. A not differentiated economy would be a commodity exporter, right? So when the copper market's good, it's good, and when it's bad, right? A not integrated economy would be an emerging market bazaar when you have 1,000 different businesses, none of whom speak to each other, right? And we, in peak capitalism, are somewhere in the middle where you have these incredibly differentiated businesses that are really seamlessly stuck together. And during COVID, everything blows up because of how seamlessly they're stuck together. The human body is the best example. Whereas, like, can you name all the different parts of a human body? It would take you like 2 hours. But yet here we are sitting in this fundamentally integrated way. So as all systems get more complex, they get both more differentiated and more integrated. So what the world wants from you is for you to become the most Bobby that you can be, while also being integrated into the system. So in like a super trivial way, you're showing great hemispheric balance by hitting a tennis ball, because you're using narrow focus to hit the ball and wide awareness to see where it's going. Activities that generate that kind of flow state tend to be really good for you because they balance the hemispheres, right? Narrow focus on something with broad situational awareness. For me, jiu-jitsu, where it's like I'm looking at my grips, but I'm also got like total awareness because I'm about to get choked out by a 250-pound man, like high stakes play, right? Now, the bit that causes the most trouble, again, in people's brains, particularly people who are closed conceptually and very left-brained, is the idea of the integration. That, like, I think if I talk about the flow state as being generated by that, then you're kind of cool. But if I start talking about the happiness you're generating in the dog being a contributor of that, that's quite easy to understand. The bit where it gets, like, mental is that I believe the environment that we habit has an intelligence to us that's greater than we could probably understand. It's difficult to say that in kind of like a non-religious context, but basically I believe that when you're doing the thing that's leading you to the correct level of differentiation, you see the integration through feedback from your environment. Now that integration may be cash money, it may be lots of clicks, but in my opinion, it's probably something more mysterious like synchronicities. So when you're doing the right thing, you see a cluster of meaningful coincidences. And the thing that's really funny about meaningful coincidences is the left hemisphere thinking can always be like, dude, you're having a psychotic break. That's just a coincidence. And the right hemisphere is like, no, that actually feels differently to me. Like it's like when something triggers your intuition. Your intuition gets triggered by a coincidence that you can't then explain to anyone else why it felt differently to you. And when you get a cluster, that's a sign that you're integrated into your environment and you should pursue your curiosity in that direction. I appreciate that's a mental worldview.
So you said something that triggered something, because we've talked about, it seems like, and I love this to go back to like decision-making stuff too, but the happiness part of it is a very, very, very interesting part of it to me. And my younger daughter used to, call me from college and, I'm down, I'm depressed. And when your daughter gets older, they're all depressed, whatever. She's fine. Don't get me wrong. But I'd always say to her that you are the most happy when you're living a life of service to others. Go out there and try to make someone else smile and try to make their day easier. And she would always test me that it works. Then I thought of just me, like even in this interaction here, like my self-worth, if I say something that I think is funny is going to make you two crack up and you do, then I feel good. That's what, I mean, like, I did it. I connected. Is that what you're talking about when you said making the dog happy and that systems and social systems are all connected? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, but there's a massive caveat that nearly cost me my life. So I take it pretty seriously. So I had like an overwhelming spiritual experience, stroke psychotic break, depending on your biases, at the end of 2017. And I was like, Jesus, this finance stuff sucks. I'm leaving forever. And I'm going to go and be a hospice worker. And I spent a while with the dying in hospitals. I spent a while trying to work as a recruiter to try and help people shift in midlife, as I saw these guys in finance not being able to do that. I went to Fordham to study social work. I tried, nearly 10 different career paths and kept applying for others that were service, that were quote unquote meaningful. Because I was like, God, I've been a finance douche my whole life, and now I need to reinvent myself because everyone tells me the second half of life is about service. And that's a massive trap, because what I was doing is I was letting the left hemisphere drive the bus again. That the left hemisphere was like, okay, so if we did a checklist of all the meaningful things and you told people that you worked in hospice, they would think that was really meaningful. Yep. And then I was like, did I enjoy working in hospice? No. So was I differentiated? The universe only likes when what only you can do meets what the world needs, right? Was I good at working in a hospice? Was I good at any of these things? Absolutely not. Did I enjoy them? Absolutely not. Were they integrated? Maybe, but the universe kept shutting down those paths to me very, very, very aggressively. And so what ended up happening years later, and kind of like crazy stories, was that I started writing about the synthesis of stuff that we're talking about now through a finance lens. And then the guys who were then at KCP, my former employers at Sapien, Tom, my partner, then saw this online and was like, this is mental, but it's interesting, and people will want to read that within a finance context. And he ended up being right. So it was like, I actually went back to what I was good at on the sell side, which was synthesizing stuff for a finance audience, but it was stuff that I cared about rather than equity research. And then I offered it in an integrated way to the world. So all I'll say to people when they're giving generic be of service advice is that often you can't pick your service. You have to experiment with a bunch of different potential services, and you have to be really selfish about the ways that you offer that service. You're talking about your restaurant, right? Your restaurant probably employs a boatload of people and people enjoy eating at it, but it's selfish to you, right? But selfish is kind of a meaningless word because nature doesn't have selfishness.
Yeah.
Right?
Who gives a shit, right? Yeah.
It's just like, no, like you're making other people happy by doing your thing. And I think that is a much healthier way of looking at things, other than like, I've got like people that go for self-sacrifice. I think that's too obvious.
You know, I always like to point out when I speak to someone who is British that one of the most interesting differentiators between actual English and American English is there's this guy called Tom Morgan, or there's this guy named Tom Morgan. I don't know why I find that fascinating.
What do you mean? What's the difference? Do they say called Tom Morgan?
They'd say call. Like I would say, oh, a friend of mine, he's named Jim Iorio. Right. And Tom would say he's this guy called Jim Iorio. It's just a weird.
I've never noticed that before.
You guys say aluminum wrong too.
Yeah. What is up with that? We just dive into that. It's not aluminium. There's not that extra letter.
They're smarter than us, so they got to make it a harder word. So here's my question. And I want to bring this back to a certain degree because most of our audience is interested in investing in markets and things, but I can't get off this subject with you. So I want to try and tie them together. Is there something from a perspective, Jimmy and I have helped individual traders for a dozen years at least now. And one of the things that I try to teach them the most is A, think of risk first, and B, do not tie your self-worth to a trade that's gone wrong, right? Because markets do what markets do, and they move independent of what you think they're going to do. I mentioned to you before the start of the show that when I blew up when I was younger, it was because I thought the market was wrong and I kept adding to that trade. Right? What you just talked about, what do you think? I mean, you were in wealth management. You had to have noticed some consistent things that people did that now you're realizing has something to do with this, either the left, right brain or the curiosity or the openness. What can help investors, active or otherwise, the most from what you've learned?
Yeah, I suck as an investor. Well, actually, I've never really tried. I watched from like 2008 onwards, I watched people who were a bajillion times smarter than me fail catastrophically over and over again, and was like, "Yeah, I'm just going to index." So like, I can't talk from a position of having done this. I can talk from a position of having obsessively studied it for 20 years. The ability, and let's call it openness, to attribute intelligence to anything outside of yourself is correlated with success. That basically, like as we were talking about earlier, the ability to attribute a very high level of intelligence to the market is just a like start there. The ability to attribute intelligence to alternative viewpoints, to like any information coming into you, to just assume that the world is smarter than you are, and then to be able to adjust very rapidly to that. And I think actually the reverse is also true. And I wish I'd learned this way earlier in my career, that think about the characteristics of the left hemisphere. It is unbelievably articulate and intelligent. And I took a lot of self-worth for a lot of my life in sounding intelligent. And all finance is the
Oh my God. Go
Yeah, me
ahead.
too. And I'm still gonna tomorrow. But yeah.
Think about like finance content is the construction of alternative futures, right? So if you had a macro talking head here, I'd be here and I'd be like, here's a picture I can paint you of the Japanese yen. And it would sound like the smartest thing you've ever heard, and you would repeat it to all these people and be like, hey, I heard this guy tell me something about Japanese yen. I realized way too late in my life that something that sounds intelligent and is internally consistent and totally logical has no natural relationship with the truth. Only one of those futures is going to be correct. And it by all means may not be the most intelligent sounding one. And that's like a really wild thing for very like bright people to understand, because they're naturally going to gravitate to the thing that sounds most intelligent. And like that just, as far as I can tell, isn't how it works. There's a great framing that I used to assess experts at Sapien when I was on the buy side, because we were an active manager, and I'd spent 15 years selling equity research, and then I spent another 4 or 5 years consuming it. And basically it was like, all right, we're going to make you jump through 3 hoops. One, you need to be able to tell us what's going on the ground right now to a maximum level of detail and relevance. 2, you need to tell us what's going to happen next, in your opinion. And then 3, you can tell us your opinion. But in that order, there's a great concept called X-formation, which is that the quality of information is determined by the amount of information discarded to create something. So you can ask me about Bitcoin right now, and my knowledge base on Bitcoin is about 2 Google pages. But I can have an opinion. But if my knowledge base on Bitcoin, like the intuitive database, is 700 years of work, and I can give you a response now that is all signal and no noise, that's a lot of X-formation. But you have no ability to determine which one of those 2 things it is on the basis of it, although intuition really helps.
This is one of the things, the reason I reacted the way I did to you talking about the sort of intellectual nature of finance guys, or the wannabe intellectuals. That's something that I've said for years and years and years. Jimmy and I get a lot of work because we're what people perceive as complex concepts, we're able to explain like we're a couple of guys, Italian guys from Chicago. And that's really, it drives me crazy when financial guys use words where there's no need for those words.
Amen.
Like they use words like, oh, you got to adjust your portfolio based on duration. And the person who was on the other side of that conversation goes, of course. And they leave and they go, what the fuck is duration? Like they don't understand it, as opposed to the time before the bond expires or before it pays. I just want to ask one last thing before I wrap this up. And it has to do with the Charlie Munger part of Charlie Chin's. Was it Charlie Chin?
Cedric Chin.
Cedric Chin. Okay. He's called Cedric Chin. Charlie Munger was always my favorite of those 2. And it was really because of the folksy analogies that you brought up in the article. Where do you think the value is in those analogies? Is it just in the simplicity of them, or is it deeper than that?
Everything in life is a metaphor. And I've realized that when I write. Like, it's actually a great question in terms of if you think about it in terms of intuition. So like when Charlie Munger says, oh, this reminds me of Kellogg in 1964. And it is like Kellogg in 1964. We're talking about pattern recognition. So he can be like, okay, so that's what happened with Kellogg in 1964. There are literally an infinite number of case studies. And therefore this one applies to that one, which gives me a really high percentage chance of knowing what's going to happen next, because it conforms to that archetypal pattern, right? So what he's saying is he has exactly the right analogy or exactly the right metaphor. When people are writing, like, she soared through the air like a brick, right? Like that's bad because it doesn't mesh to reality. And so when you're writing, if your metaphor doesn't work, it's not accurate to the real life, the lived experience. So in investing and in life in general, the more accurate your metaphor is, the more accurately it's going to approximate reality, which actually is a left-right hemisphere thing, that you're taking in this data in the right hemisphere. And then can you put into words that really accurately reflect something? And then do you test that against reality again to see like, yeah, that really resonates. That really makes sense. And that when people think about Charlie Munger, they think he's just being all like folksy and cute, Whereas actually what he's demonstrating then is like elite level pattern recognition, which he got because he was constantly feeding that database, but he was then able to pull the relevant stuff out of it at exactly the right time, which is the meta skill in trading, in investing. It's like, there's no point having that database if you've got dementia and you can't pull anything out of it, right?
It's amazing. Okay, Tom, before we wrap it up, can you tell the people where to find you? I just followed you on Twitter. I think I went over your feed today. It's amazing. Is that the best place to read what you're putting out?
Yeah, that's the best place to get to me. My family obviously hates the fact that I'm that active on Twitter. I neglect my children. I am
We all do.
at Tom Owen Morgan on Twitter. Give me an alert. It'll distract from my 5-year-old. And then there's a Substack in there called What's Important. I am launching a company in the next month or so called Leading Edge, where we're actually going to formalize content in a community around this whole pursuit of wisdom, right hemispherification idea. And you can follow us for updates there.
That's fantastic. If you need anyone, to partner up with, we are taking on sponsors, but not sponsors who will ever tell us what to say or what we can't say. But anyway, we're going to close it out.
When it launches, because we'd like to help you push that.
Yeah, we'd like to help you with it for sure. Yeah. But this has been the Futures Edge Show. I'm Jim Uriel. It's Bob Iacino. That's Tom Morgan. He's at Tom Owen Morgan on Twitter. This show doesn't work. It doesn't even exist without you guys showing your support. Remember what Bobby and I are trying to do, what our mission is. We were both long time in mainstream media. We were both bounced out of it because we wouldn't comply with their bullshit sponsorship and what we're supposed to say and what we're not. We're trying to create a platform where people can give opinions. The opinions might be bullshit, but at least they're honest opinions and they're not being pushed by some sponsors. Thank you guys for joining us. This is the Futures Edge.